I wasn't supposed to be the bride that night, but somehow, I became the woman the most dangerous man in the room chose to stand beside. The violin was too loud for how quiet I felt, each note echoing off the crystal chandeliers like it belonged to a different life, one where women like me didn't sit alone at the edge of a ballroom pretending they didn't notice the stairs. My name is Emily Carter, 27, single mom, wearing a dress I bought on clearance 2 years ago, sitting at a wedding where my past was getting a second chance I was never offered. I kept my hands wrapped around a glass of sparkling water I couldn't bring myself to drink, watching people laugh, dance, celebrate like love was simple, like it didn't leave you behind. Across the room, my ex-fiancé adjusted his tie, smiling at his new bride like nothing had ever been broken, like I had never existed. I told myself I was here for closure, but closure didn't look like this. It looked like swallowing pride while pretending your heart wasn't beating too loud in your chest. I should have left. I almost did. But then the doors opened, and the room changed. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a shift, like the air itself knew something powerful had entered. Conversations slowed. Laughter dimmed. Even the music seemed to hesitate. And then I saw him. He didn't rush, didn't need to. Every step he took carried weight, quiet authority wrapped in a perfectly tailored black suit that fit like it was made for him and him alone. Tall, composed, the kind of man who didn't look around to see who was watching because he already knew they were. Alexander Rossi. I didn't know his name yet, but I felt it, the gravity of him, the way people subtly moved aside without being asked. He wasn't just a guest. He was the reason the room held its breath. I looked away quickly, the instinct to stay invisible kicking in, but something in me hesitated, just long enough for his gaze to find me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was direct. Intentional. Like he had already decided something before I even realized I was part of the equation. I dropped my eyes to the table, heat creeping up my neck, telling myself it meant nothing, that men like him didn't notice women like me. But seconds later, I felt it again. Presence. Closer now. I didn't hear his footsteps, just the quiet scrape of a chair being pulled beside me. My fingers tightened around the glass. I didn't look up right away. I didn't want to. Because somehow, I already knew. You're sitting alone, his voice was low, controlled, the kind that didn't ask questions unless it already knew the answer. I lifted my eyes slowly, and there he was, closer than expected, sharper than any thought I could form, his expression unreadable but focused entirely on me. I swallowed. It's just a seat, I said, softer than I intended. A faint curve touched his lips, not quite a smile. Not kind. Not cruel. Just certain. He leaned slightly closer, enough for his words to feel private even in a crowded room. Pretend you're my wife, he said. My breath caught before I could stop it. And dance with me. My first instinct was to laugh, because men like him did not ask women like me to pretend anything, they simply chose and expected the world to adjust, but nothing about his expression suggested this was a joke and nothing about the way the room seemed to lean in his direction made me feel like I could dismiss him either, so I set my glass down slowly, buying myself a second to breathe, to think, to remind myself that I was not someone who followed strangers onto dance floors just because they asked, even if those strangers looked like they could rewrite the rules of the room without raising their voice. I think you have the wrong person, I said, keeping my tone steady even though my pulse was starting to race. I am not who you are looking for. His eyes did not move from mine, not even a flicker, like he was studying something deeper than the words I chose, like he could see straight through the careful distance I had spent years building. I know exactly who I am looking for. He replied, calm, certain, the kind of certainty that made arguing feel pointless. I shook my head, a small movement, but enough to create space. I do not dance with strangers, I added, and for a second I thought that would be enough, that he would stand. Walk away, find someone else more suited to his world, someone polished, confident, someone who belonged here, but instead he leaned back slightly, as if considering me from a different angle, and the faintest hint of something unreadable crossed his face, not annoyance, not impatience, something quieter, more deliberate. "Then do not think of me as a stranger," he said, and before I could respond, he stood, extending his hand toward me in a gesture that was impossible to ignore, not forceful, not demanding, but undeniably present. I hesitated, aware of the eyes beginning to turn in our direction, aware of the subtle shift in the room as people started to notice, whispers forming before words, my ex-fiancé glancing over from across the floor, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to place the man standing beside me, and suddenly this was no longer just about me, it was about being seen, about being measured, about being the woman who had shown up alone and stayed that way. Or the woman who stood when someone like him asked her to. My fingers curled slightly against my palm, a reflex, a shield, but his hand remained there, steady, patient, like he already knew how this would end. "You said pretend," I said quietly, meeting his gaze again. "Why me?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and for the first time, something shifted in his eyes, not softer, but sharper, more focused. Like the answer mattered, because you are the only one in this room not pretending already, he said, and the words landed somewhere deeper than I expected, cutting through the noise, the music, the carefully constructed walls I had built around myself. For a moment I forgot where I was, forgot who was watching, forgot everything except the strange, steady feeling that he was offering something I did not fully understand but could not easily refuse. I glanced down at his hand one last time. Then slowly, deliberately, I placed mine in his, and the moment our hands touched, the room changed again. Not because he pulled me forward, but because he did not have to. I stood on my own, and as he guided me toward the dance floor, I felt every pair of eyes follow us, felt the weight of judgment, curiosity, disbelief, but none of it reached me the way it had before, because his grip was firm without being restrictive, controlled without being cold, and for the first time that night, I was not the woman sitting alone at the edge of someone else's story. I was the woman being led into something I had not planned. Something I did not understand. And as the music shifted into a slower rhythm and his hand settled at my side with precise distance, he leaned just close enough for only me to hear. "Do exactly as I say," he murmured, his voice low, steady, "and do not look behind you." My breath caught, the warning threading through his words clear without needing explanation, and suddenly this was not just a dance anymore. The music slowed into something softer, almost deceptive. Like it wanted to convince the room this was just another romantic moment instead of whatever it actually was. And I let him guide me because I did not know what else to do, my hand resting in his other hand steady at my side, never inappropriate, never careless, just controlled in a way that made it clear he was used to being obeyed without needing to raise his voice. I focused on the rhythm, on the simple step forward and back, anything to keep from turning around like he warned me not to. Anything to keep my thoughts from spiraling into questions I did not have answers to. "You are doing fine," he murmured, his voice low enough that it blended into the music, and I almost missed the fact that he was not asking, he was telling, like my performance mattered to him for reasons I still did not understand. "You still have not told me why," I said quietly, keeping my eyes level with his collar instead of his face, because looking directly at him felt like stepping too far into something I could not control. "Why me, why this?" He adjusted our position slightly, turning us just enough that the room shifted around us, and I realized it was intentional, like he was placing us exactly where he wanted us to be. "Because someone is watching you," he said, and the words landed heavier than I expected, my breath catching just enough to break my rhythm for half a second. Before he steadied me without effort. "Do not stop," he added, softer this time, and I swallowed, forcing myself to move with him again, to trust the direction even if I did not trust the situation. "Who?" I asked, barely above a whisper, but he did not answer right away. Instead his gaze flicked briefly over my shoulder and then back to me, sharper now, more focused, like the room had narrowed to a single point. "Someone who should not have noticed you tonight," he said, and a chill traced its way down my spine, not because I felt immediate danger, but because of the way he said it, calm, measured, like this was something he had already calculated, already decided how to handle. I resisted the urge to turn, every instinct screaming at me to see for myself, but his earlier warning held me in place, and instead I tightened my grip on his hand just slightly, grounding myself in something real, something present. "I am not important enough for anyone to notice," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them, a truth I had lived with for years, but something in his expression changed again, subtle, almost invisible, like he disagreed in a way that did not need to be argued. "That is where you are wrong," he replied, and for a moment the noise of the room faded again, replaced by the strange weight of his certainty. He turned us once more, slower this time, bringing me just a little closer into the space he controlled, not possessive, not overwhelming, just enough to make it clear that anyone watching would see exactly what he wanted them to see, and I felt it then, the shift in attention, the way conversations around us dipped, the way eyes lingered longer than they should, as if the story of the night had quietly changed direction without anyone announcing it. "Stay with me," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, and I realized this was no longer about pretending for appearances. This was about being placed exactly where he needed me to be, for reasons that extended far beyond a simple dance. I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, because leaving was no longer an option that made sense, not when I still did not understand what I had been pulled into, not when his presence, steady and controlled, was the only thing anchoring me in a room that suddenly felt unfamiliar. And as the music carried us into another slow turn, I felt it again, that subtle shift behind me, like attention sharpening, focusing, and even without looking, I knew something had changed, and whatever it was, Alexander Rossi had already seen it coming. The air felt different now, like the room had quietly shifted into something sharper, more aware, and I followed his lead without questioning it because every instinct told me he understood this space in a way I never could, his movements precise, deliberate, guiding me through each step as if the dance itself was a language and he was fluent in every part of it. "Do not react," he said softly, his tone unchanged, but there was a weight behind it now, something that made my chest tighten just slightly. "No matter what you hear." I nodded almost imperceptibly, focusing on the steady rhythm of the music, on the way his hand anchored me in place without restricting me, and then I heard it, not loud, not obvious, just a voice somewhere behind me, low and unfamiliar, saying my name, not loudly enough to draw attention, but enough to make my breath catch, because it was not a name anyone here should have known. I kept my expression still, forcing myself not to turn, not to break whatever careful illusion he had created. "Good," he murmured, noticing the way I held steady. "Keep your eyes on me." I lifted my gaze just slightly, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since we stepped onto the floor, and there it was again, that intensity, that focus. Like everything else in the room had faded into the background and I was the only variable he was tracking. "Who is that?" I asked quietly, my voice controlled but strained at the edges. "Someone who thought you would be easier to reach tonight," he replied, and something about the phrasing made my stomach drop, not because I understood completely, but because I did not, because I had walked into this evening expecting discomfort, not complication, not whatever this was turning into. He turned us again, positioning my back toward a different part of the room, subtly shifting our orientation without drawing attention, and I realized he was controlling what I could and could not see, limiting my view while expanding his. "You are doing exactly what I need," he added, and the words should have unsettled me more than they did, but instead they grounded me, gave me something to hold on to in a moment that felt increasingly uncertain. "I do not like being part of something I do not understand," I admitted, the honesty slipping out before I could filter it, and for a brief second, something softer crossed his expression, not weakness, not vulnerability, just acknowledgement. "You are not part of it," he said, "you are the reason it is not happening the way they planned." The statement hung between us, heavy and incomplete, raising more questions than it answered, but there was no time to ask them, because the voice came again, closer this time, just enough for me to feel the presence shift behind me, the subtle pressure of attention narrowing, and I felt his hand adjust slightly at my side, firmer now, not restrictive, just enough to signal that something had changed. "Stay close," he said, quieter now, almost a breath against the music, and I did, because stepping away no longer felt like an option that made sense, not when every movement around us seemed calculated, not when his presence had become the only constant in a room that no longer felt familiar. The music carried us through another slow turn, and I felt it again, that invisible line drawing tighter, like whatever had been watching was no longer observing from a distance, and as his gaze sharpened just slightly, tracking something over my shoulder, I realized this was not a coincidence, not a random encounter. and whatever had started the moment he chose me from across the room was still unfolding, piece by piece, with me standing exactly where he wanted me to be. The moment stretched thinner, tighter, like something invisible was being pulled just beneath the surface of the music, and I could feel it now in the way Alexander moved, still smooth, still controlled, but more deliberate, like every step we took was placing us exactly where he needed us to be. Listen carefully, he said under his breath, his voice calm but edged with something sharper now. When the song ends, you do not go back to your table. My fingers tightened slightly in his without thinking, a quiet reaction I could not stop. Then where do I go? I asked, keeping my voice low, steady, even though nothing about this felt steady anymore. He did not answer right away, his gaze shifting past me again, tracking something I could not see, something I was beginning to feel without understanding. With me, he said finally, and the certainty in those two words left no room for hesitation. I should have questioned it, should have stepped back, reminded myself that I did not know him, that this was not my world, but the truth settled somewhere deeper, quieter, telling me that whatever had just shifted in this room, it had already involved me whether I wanted it to or not. And walking away blindly felt more dangerous than staying where I was. You still have not told me why they know my name, I pressed gently, needing something, anything that made sense, and this time his eyes returned to mine fully, holding my attention in a way that made everything else fade again. Because someone here asked about you before I arrived, he said, and my stomach dropped, not sharply, but enough to make my breath feel uneven for a second. That does not make sense, I whispered, more to myself than to him, because it did not. I had kept to myself, stayed quiet. Invisible, just another guest on the edge of someone else's celebration. It does not have to make sense yet, he replied, and there was no frustration in his tone, just patience, like he was used to operating in situations where others were always one step behind. It only has to be managed. The word lingered, heavier than it should have been, and I realized that to him, this was already something under control, already something he was navigating with precision, even if I could not see the full shape of it yet. The music began to shift toward its final notes, slower, softer, the kind of ending that signaled closure for everyone else on the floor, but for me, it felt like the beginning of something I had not agreed to step into. His hand at my side adjusted again, just slightly, guiding me closer into his space as the final turn approached, and I did not resist, not because I trusted him completely, but because I trusted the way he had not let anything around us spiral out of control, not even for a second. Stay with me when it ends, he said quietly, his voice steady, grounding. Do not hesitate. I nodded once, small but certain, because hesitation felt like the one thing that could break whatever invisible line he had drawn around us. The music faded into silence, and for a brief moment, the room filled with applause, with laughter, with the normal sounds of celebration returning like nothing had shifted at all. But beneath it, I felt it again, that same tension, sharper now, closer, and before I could even think about stepping away, his hand closed around mine just enough to guide me forward, not pulling, not forcing, just leading with quiet certainty as he moved us off the dance floor, away from the center, towards something I could not yet see, and as I followed, I realized I was no longer wondering if I should trust him. I was wondering what would happen if I did not. He did not rush, and that was the first thing I noticed as we moved away from the dance floor, not the direction, not the people stepping subtly aside to make space for him, but the pace, steady and controlled, like he understood that panic came from being pushed too fast and he had no intention of letting that happen to me. His hand still around mine, firm enough to guide, never tight enough to trap, and I followed because stopping now would have meant standing still in a room that no longer felt safe in the way it had when I first arrived. Keep walking, he said quietly, his voice blending into the hum of conversation that had returned around us, and I nodded even though he could not see it, focusing on each step, on the simple act of moving forward instead of turning back. We passed the tables, the soft glow of candles, the half-finished glasses and folded napkins, and I felt the weight of eyes again, not curious this time, but aware, like something about our movement had been noticed by the wrong person. Do not look at anyone who looks at you, he added, and I let out a slow breath, grounding myself in his instructions because they were the only clear thing in a moment that felt anything but. You give a lot of orders, I said under my breath, not quite challenging, not quite teasing, just needing something normal to hold on to, and for a brief second, the corner of his mouth shifted, almost like he understood exactly what I was doing. Only when it matters, he replied. And something in his tone made it clear that this was one of those times. We reached the edge of the ballroom where the lighting softened and the noise dipped just slightly, a transition space between the center of attention and the quiet edges people forgot about, and that was when I felt it again, closer now, the same presence that had followed us through the dance, not visible, not obvious, but there in the way the air seemed to tighten just slightly. "They are still there, aren't they?" I asked, keeping my voice even, because fear did not feel useful here, only awareness, and he did not deny it. "Yes," he said simply, his eyes scanning past me once more, calculating, measuring, "but they are hesitating." I frowned slightly, not understanding. "Why?" I asked, and this time he looked at me directly, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Because you are with me," he said. And the words settled into something deeper than reassurance, something closer to realization. This was not just about being near him, it was about being seen near him, about what that signaled to anyone watching, about the invisible lines of power I did not understand but was now standing inside of. We turned down a quieter hallway just beyond the ballroom doors, the music fading behind us into something distant and muffled, replaced by the softer sounds of the venue, footsteps, distant voices, the quiet hum of a space not meant for the main event, and for the first time since he had sat beside me, I felt a small shift in the tension, not gone, but thinner, less immediate, like we had stepped just outside the center of whatever had been building. He slowed slightly then, enough for me to match him without thinking, and finally released my hand, not abruptly, not carelessly, just a quiet absence that I felt more than I expected. "You can breathe now," he said, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my shoulders loosening just slightly as I leaned back against the wall for a second, trying to process everything that had just happened. "You make that sound simple," I said, glancing at him. And he watched me for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, just observing in that same focused way that had started all of this. "Simple does not mean easy," he replied, and then, after a brief pause, "Are you all right?" The question caught me off guard, not because of the words, but because of the way he asked it, direct, genuine, like my answer actually mattered. And I nodded slowly, even though the truth was more complicated than that. "I think so," I said, and then, quieter. "But I still do not understand why any of this is happening." He held my gaze for a moment longer, as if deciding how much to say, how much I needed to know, and then his expression shifted just slightly, something more serious settling in. "You will," he said, calm and certain, "but first, I need to know something." His tone changed just enough to make my attention sharpen again. "Before tonight," he continued, "did anyone unusual try to contact you, ask about you, or get close to you in a way that did not feel right?" The question lingered in the quiet hallway, heavier than anything he had said before, and for the first time, I realized this might not have started when he walked into the room. It might have started long before I even knew to pay attention. I did not answer right away because the question did not feel simple, not when my mind immediately started replaying the past few days like it was searching for something I had missed, something small that had not mattered at the time but suddenly felt important now. And I pushed myself off the wall slowly, folding my arms. Without realizing it, a quiet instinct to protect, to think before I spoke. "I do not think so," I said at first, but even as the words left my mouth, doubt followed them, thin but persistent, and he noticed. Of course he did, his gaze sharpening just slightly, not impatient, just waiting, like he understood that silence often meant there was more beneath the surface. "Think carefully," he said, softer now, and I closed my eyes for a brief second, forcing myself to go back, not just to tonight, but to before it, to the ordinary days that had not felt like anything worth remembering, until now. "There was something," I admitted slowly, opening my eyes again, his attention fixed entirely on me. "Yesterday, at the grocery store." It sounded insignificant even as I said it, but I kept going, because something about the memory would not let go. "A man asked if I worked at the daycare on Maple Street." I frowned slightly, trying to piece it together. I told him no, that I worked at a different one, and he just smiled, like he already knew that, like he was checking. Alexander did not interrupt, did not react visibly, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, controlled. "Did you recognize him?" he asked, and I shook my head. "No, I have never seen him before, and I thought it was just a mistake. People confuse places all the time. I paused, then added more quietly, but he knew my name. The hallway felt quieter after that, like even the distant sounds from the ballroom had pulled back, giving space to the weight of that detail. He said it like we had already met. I continued, my voice lower now, more certain as the memory settled into something clearer, and when I told him he was wrong, he just said, right, Emily Carter, and walked away. Alexander exhaled slowly, not surprised, not shocked, just confirming something in his mind that had already been forming. And tonight you came here alone, he said, more statement than question, and I nodded. Yes, I answered, then added, I did not think any of that mattered. He stepped a little closer then, not invading, just closing the distance enough that I could feel the shift in focus again, that same controlled intensity that had pulled me into all of this in the first place. It matters, he said, calm, direct, because it means you were not chosen tonight by chance. The words settled deeper than anything else he had said, not alarming in a loud way, but unsettling in a quiet, undeniable one, because it meant this was not random, not coincidence, not just a strange encounter at a wedding. Then why are you involved? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because that part still did not make sense, and for a moment, he did not answer, his gaze shifting briefly down the hallway, always aware, always calculating, before returning to me, because whoever asked about you did not expect me to notice, he said finally, and there it was again, that invisible line I did not understand but was now standing inside of, drawn not by me, but around me, and somehow connected to him. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady the way my thoughts were moving faster than I could organize them. So what happens now? I asked, quieter this time, because whatever this was, it was no longer something I could pretend to ignore. And his expression settled into something firm, resolved, like the next step had already been decided long before I asked. Now, he said, his voice low and certain, you do not go anywhere alone tonight, and something in the way he said it made it clear that this was not a suggestion, not control for the sake of it, but protection, deliberate and immediate. And for the first time since this started, I did not feel like arguing with him for a moment. Neither of us moved, the quiet of the hallway settling around us like a fragile pause between decisions, and I realized how strange it was that I was standing here with a man I had met less than 10 minutes ago, listening to him tell me what I could and could not do, and instead of resisting, I was trying to understand what came next. I have a son, I said suddenly, the words leaving me before I could filter them, because it mattered, because everything mattered now. His attention shifted instantly, not surprised, just focused in a different way. He is at home with a sitter, I added quickly, watching for any reaction, any change that might tell me if I had just complicated things further. But his expression remained steady, thoughtful, like he was placing that information into whatever calculation he was already making. Is anyone else aware you are here tonight? He asked, and I shook my head. No, just the bride, and maybe a few people who recognized me. I hesitated, then added, no one important. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, like he disagreed with that last part but chose not to correct it. Everyone becomes important when someone decides they are, he said quietly. And the statement settled into something heavier than it should have been. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my thoughts from racing too far ahead. So what do we do? I asked again, more grounded this time, less uncertain, because if I was already part of this, then standing still was not going to change that. He glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance, where the distant sound of music and conversation filtered through, then back at me, his expression sharpening just slightly. We changed the pattern, he said. And there was something decisive in the way he said it, like this was the moment everything shifted direction. They expect you to leave alone, he continued, to follow the same path you would have taken if I had not stepped in. I nodded slowly, because that was exactly what I had planned. Slip out quietly, avoid attention, go home to a life that felt predictable again. So we do the opposite, he finished, and I frowned slightly. Meaning? I asked, and this time, there was no pause, no hesitation in his response. You stay visible, he said, with me. The words landed differently now, not like a strange request, but like a strategy, something intentional, something designed to shift attention in a way I could not fully see but was beginning to understand. That feels like the exact opposite of safe, I admitted, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something close to reassurance in his tone, not soft, not comforting, just certain. It is, he said, for them. I held his gaze, searching for doubt, for uncertainty, for anything that suggested he was guessing instead of knowing, but there was none, just that same controlled confidence that had anchored me from the moment he sat down beside me. And for me, I asked quietly, because that part still mattered, still felt unresolved. He did not look away when he answered, for you, it means they hesitate, he said, and hesitation gives me time. The hallway seemed even quieter after that, like the decision had already been made and I was just catching up to it. I nodded once, slower this time, because whether I understood everything or not, I understood enough to know that walking away now was no longer an option that made sense. All right, I said, the word steadier than I expected, and something in his posture shifted again, not tension, not relief, just confirmation, like he had expected that answer all along. Good, he replied simply, then stepped back just enough to re-establish that careful distance he always maintained. Then we go back, he added, and before I could second guess it, before doubt could catch up with me, he turned toward the ballroom, and I followed, not because I had no choice, but because somewhere between the dance and the hallway, I had already decided that staying beside him felt safer than facing whatever was waiting alone. Walking back into the ballroom felt different this time, like I was stepping into the same place but not as the same person, and I felt it immediately in the way the room responded, not loudly, not in a way anyone would openly acknowledge, but in the subtle shifts, the glances that lasted a second longer, the conversations that paused just slightly before continuing, because now I was not alone, now I was walking beside him, and that changed everything. Alexander did not slow down, did not hesitate, his pace steady as he guided us back into the center of the room without touching me, without needing to, the space around him adjusting naturally as if it had already accepted his presence as something fixed, something immovable, and I stayed close, not clinging, not uncertain, just aware of where I needed to be, because stepping out of that invisible boundary now felt like stepping into something I did not understand. Stay to my left, he said quietly as we moved, and I adjusted without thinking, aligning my steps with his, the instructions simple but precise, and I realized again how deliberate everything about him was, nothing wasted, nothing accidental. We passed the tables again, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off glass and silverware, and I caught a glimpse of my ex-fiancé across the room, his expression no longer confused but something closer to unsettled, like he was trying to make sense of a version of me that did not fit the story he had already rewritten. I looked away quickly, not because it hurt, but because it no longer mattered in the way it had an hour ago. Good, Alexander murmured under his breath, noticing the shift without needing to ask, and I felt something steady settle in my chest, not confidence exactly, but something close enough to hold on to. We stopped near the center again, not on the dance floor this time, but close enough to remain visible, close enough to be seen, and I understood now what he meant. This was not about blending in, this was about being unmistakable, about changing the pattern so completely that anyone watching would have to reconsider their next move. Do you see anyone familiar? He asked, his voice low, controlled, and I resisted the instinct to scan the room too quickly, instead letting my gaze move naturally, casually, the way someone would if they had nothing to hide, nothing to search for. And then I saw him, not directly, not clearly, but enough, a man standing near the edge of the room, partially turned away, his attention not on the celebration but on us, and something about the way he held himself, still, observant, made my breath catch just slightly. There, I said quietly, not pointing, just shifting my gaze for a fraction of a second before returning it forward, near the back. Alexander did not turn immediately, did not react in any visible way, but I felt the subtle change in him, the way his attention sharpened without moving. Describe him, he said, and I did, quietly, carefully, focusing on what I could remember without staring too long. The dark jacket, the way his posture did not match the relaxed atmosphere of the room, the fact that he had not looked away even when our eyes almost met. Good, Alexander said again, softer this time, and there was something different in his tone now, something closer to confirmation than instruction. He was not supposed to show himself, he added, almost to himself, and the words sent a quiet chill through me, because it meant this was not just observation anymore, this was something shifting, something moving forward. What does that mean? I asked, my voice steady even though my thoughts were not, and this time, he turned slightly, just enough to adjust our position again, placing me a fraction closer to his side, reinforcing that invisible line I had come to rely on without realizing it. It means, he said, his voice low and certain, they are running out of patience, and the way he said it made one thing clear, whatever happened next was not going to be passive anymore, and for the first time since this began, I realized that standing beside him did not just make me visible, it made me part of something that was already in motion. Something that was not going to stop just because I wished it would. The space between us and the man at the back of the room did not close, but it felt like it did, like something invisible was tightening with every second we remained exactly where Alexander wanted us to be, visible, deliberate, impossible to ignore, and I realized that this was no longer about avoiding attention, it was about controlling it, shaping it into something that worked in his favor instead of against it. Do not acknowledge him again, Alexander said quietly, his voice calm but carrying that same edge of precision I had come to recognize. If he believes you are aware, he will change his approach. I nodded slightly, forcing my gaze to settle somewhere neutral, somewhere safe, even though every instinct wanted to look back, to confirm what I had already seen, to understand more, but I resisted, because trusting his instructions had become the only thing that made sense. What happens if he comes closer? I asked, keeping my tone even, and Alexander shifted his stance just slightly, placing himself a fraction more in front of me without making it obvious, a small adjustment that changed everything about how we were positioned. Then he makes a mistake, he said simply, and something in the certainty of that answer steadied me more than any reassurance could have. The music changed again, something lighter this time, and the room seemed to relax on the surface, laughter rising, glasses clinking, the illusion of normal returning for everyone except us, because beneath it, I could still feel the tension, still sense the way attention lingered longer than it should. Walk with me, Alexander added, and we moved again, not toward the exit, not toward the edges, but through the center, weaving naturally through the crowd like we belonged there, like this was exactly where we were supposed to be, and I followed without hesitation, matching his pace, his direction, because the rhythm of his movements had become something I could rely on, something predictable in a moment that was anything but. You are doing better than most would, he said after a second, his voice quieter now, almost conversational, and I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but close. I am not sure that is a compliment, I replied, and the faintest hint of something softened in his expression again, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. It is an observation, he said, and then his attention shifted, sharper now, focused on something just past my shoulder, and I felt it again, that presence, closer this time, no longer distant, no longer just watching from the edge of the room. Do not stop, he murmured, his tone lower, more deliberate, and I kept walking, even as every part of me became more aware of the space around us, the subtle changes, the way the air seemed to tighten just slightly as someone moved within it. He is moving, I said under my breath, not looking, just feeling it, and Alexander's response was immediate, not in words, but in action, his hand briefly brushing against mine, a controlled, grounding contact that lasted only a second but anchored me completely. Good, he said, almost too quietly to hear. Let him. The word surprised me, but I did not question them, because everything he had done so far had been intentional, calculated, and stepping outside of that now felt like breaking something I did not understand. We slowed near one of the central pillars, the kind that divided the room without drawing attention, and he positioned us there, angled just enough to see without being directly exposed, and for the first time, he allowed his gaze to shift fully, to acknowledge what I had only sensed, his eyes locking onto something behind me, steady, unflinching, and I felt the moment stretch again, thin and precise, like everything was balancing on a line that had not yet broken. Stay exactly where you are, he said, his voice calm but absolute, and I did, because moving now felt like the one thing I should not do. And then, just over his shoulder, I saw it, the man stepping closer into the open, no longer hidden by distance or distraction, and even without knowing who he was, I understood one thing clearly: he was not here by accident, and whatever reason had brought him here was now moving directly toward us. He did not step closer immediately, and that was what made it worse, the pause, the space he allowed between us, like he wanted to be seen before he was heard, like his presence alone was part of whatever message he intended to deliver. and I felt the shift ripple outward, subtle but undeniable, the way a few conversations near us quieted without anyone fully turning, the way the room adjusted around a moment it did not yet understand. "Do not move," Alexander said again, softer this time, but no less absolute. And I held my position, even as my heartbeat picked up, even as every instinct told me to step back. To create distance from something that felt too focused, too deliberate, the man stopped a few feet away, not invading, not aggressive, just close enough to make his attention impossible to ignore, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost polite. "Emily Carter," he said, like he had every right to say it, like he had been waiting for the moment to use it, and the sound of my name in his voice felt different than it had before. Heavier now, intentional in a way that made it clear this was not coincidence. I did not answer, not because I could not, but because Alexander had not told me to, and somehow that mattered more than my own instinct to respond. "You were not easy to find," the man continued, his gaze steady, not shifting, not distracted, and I felt Alexander move just slightly beside me, not stepping in front of me completely, but enough to redraw that invisible line I had come to recognize. "You are speaking to someone who is not available," Alexander said, his tone even, controlled, carrying no more volume than necessary but somehow cutting through the space between us with quiet authority. The man's attention shifted then, just briefly, just enough to acknowledge him. And something unspoken passed between them, something I could not hear but could feel, like two opposing decisions meeting in the same place. "I was not aware she required permission," the man replied, still calm, but there was something sharper beneath it now, something less polite than his words suggested, and Alexander did not react immediately, did not rise to it, he simply held his ground, his presence steady in a way that made everything else feel less certain by comparison. "Now you are," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything louder could have. The man studied him for a second longer, his gaze narrowing just slightly, as if recalculating, reassessing the situation in front of him, and for the first time since he approached, I saw hesitation, not fear, not retreat, just a pause where certainty had been before. "This does not concern you," he said finally, redirecting his focus toward me again, but something had changed, something less confident, less controlled. "It does now," Alexander replied, and this time there was no mistaking it, no space for interpretation. The line had been drawn clearly, undeniably, and I felt it settle around me like something solid, something protective in a way I had not expected. The silence that followed was brief but heavy, filled with everything neither of them was saying out loud, and then the man exhaled slowly, stepping back just enough to re-establish distance, not surrendering, not conceding, but choosing not to push further in this moment. "We will speak again," he said, his tone quieter now, directed at me, and I felt Alexander's attention sharpen again, tracking every word, every movement, but he did not interrupt this time, did not need to, because the shift had already happened, the balance had already tilted, and as the man turned and disappeared back into the crowd, the tension did not vanish with him, it lingered, thinner now, but still present, like something unfinished, something waiting for its next move, and I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my focus returning slowly to the man beside me, the one who had stepped into something that was never his to begin with, and somehow made it his anyway. "What was that?" I asked quietly, because the question felt unavoidable now, and Alexander did not look away from where the man had been, his gaze steady, calculating, as if already thinking several steps ahead. "That," he said after a moment, his voice calm but edged with certainty, "was the reason you were not meant to sit alone tonight." The space he left behind did not fill back in right away. It stayed open, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if something else would follow, and I realized that even though he had walked away, whatever he wanted had not ended, it had only been delayed. "Do not let that settle," Alexander said quietly, his voice pulling me back before my thoughts could drift too far, and I turned slightly toward him, still aware of everything around us, but grounded again by the way he spoke, steady, controlled, like nothing about that exchange had surprised him. "That did not feel over," I admitted, and he nodded once, not dismissing it, not softening it, just confirming what I already knew. "It is not," he said, and there was no hesitation in his answer, no attempt to make it sound less than it was. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of that reality settle into something I could hold without letting it overwhelm me, because reacting too strongly now felt like giving something away. something I could not afford to lose. Then why did he leave? I asked, keeping my voice low, because the question mattered, because understanding even a part of this felt better than standing in the dark. Alexander's gaze shifted briefly across the room again, tracking patterns I could not see, before returning to me. Because he was not prepared for me to be here, he said, and the simplicity of it made sense in a way nothing else had yet. He expected access, not resistance. I nodded slowly, processing that, understanding now that whatever had been planned had been interrupted the moment Alexander chose me, the moment he made it clear I was not alone. So what changes now? I asked, and this time, his answer came faster, more decisive, like this was the part he had already been moving toward. Now we control how this ends, he said, and something in his tone shifted again, not just calculated, but resolved, like the uncertainty had narrowed into direction. He stepped slightly closer, not enough to draw attention, just enough that his voice could drop even lower without being overheard. You leave with me, he added, and I blinked, not because the idea shocked me, but because of how final it sounded, how complete. Tonight, he clarified, reading the hesitation before I could voice it. You do not go back to your car alone, you do not call for a ride, you do not change your routine. Each instruction landed with quiet precision, not controlling for the sake of control, but protective in a way that felt immediate, necessary. And tomorrow, I asked, because this did not feel like something that ended when the night did, and he did not pretend otherwise. Tomorrow we make sure no one else can approach you without being seen first, he said, and there it was again, that shift from reaction to strategy, from uncertainty to something structured, something planned. I studied him for a second, really looked this time, not just at the surface, not just at the presence that commanded a room, but at the intention behind it, the way everything he did connected, aligned, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped questioning whether I should trust him and started questioning how much I already did. You are very certain about all of this, I said quietly, and for the first time, his expression changed in a way I had not seen before, not softer, not lighter, just more direct, more personal. Because I do not make decisions like this lightly, he replied, and the weight of that statement settled into something deeper than reassurance, something that felt chosen, deliberate, and I felt it then, the shift inside me, subtle but undeniable, the moment where fear gave way to something steadier, something more focused, because whatever this was, whatever had started before I even noticed it, I was not facing it alone anymore. And as the music continued behind us, as the room slowly returned to its version of normal, I understood one thing clearly: this night had already changed direction, and there was no going back to the version of it where I sat quietly at a table pretending none of this existed. We did not leave immediately, and that surprised me more than anything else, because part of me had expected him to move the moment he made that decision, to act without pause the way he had all night, but instead he stayed, just long enough for the room to settle again. Just long enough to make our exit feel like a choice instead of a reaction, and I realized that even this, even waiting, was intentional. We do not rush, he said quietly, as if reading the thought before I could form it, and I nodded, understanding now that leaving too quickly would mean something, would signal something to the wrong person. So we stayed, not long, not enough to lose control of the moment, just enough to reshape it, to make it ours again. I adjusted my posture slightly, no longer trying to disappear, no longer shrinking into the edges of the room, and the difference was immediate, subtle but real. The way people looked at me now, not with curiosity or quiet judgment, but with something closer to uncertainty, because standing beside him had changed the story they thought they understood. And for the first time that night, I was not reacting to the room, I was part of what was shaping it. Ready? He asked, not as a command this time, but as a confirmation, and I met his gaze, steady, certain in a way I had not been before. Yes, I said, and it felt true, not because I understood everything, but because I understood enough. He gave a small nod, then turned, not toward the main doors, but toward a side exit, quieter, less obvious, and I followed without hesitation, matching his pace as we moved through the space one last time, the music fading behind us, the light shifting as we stepped away from the center of the ballroom and into the softer glow of the hallway. And this time, it did not feel like escape, it felt like transition, like stepping out of one version of the night and into another. The door opened easily, a quiet push into the cool air outside, and I took a breath without thinking, the change immediate, grounding, real, the distant sound of the reception muffled behind us as the door closed, sealing that part of the night away. We paused for a moment, not because we needed to, but because the shift in space demanded it, the quiet of the parking area stretching around us, the lights casting long shadows across the pavement, and I felt it again, that awareness, not fear this time, but focus, because this was no longer just about what had happened inside. It was about what came next. Stay close, he said, his voice low but steady, and I did, not because I was told, but because it made sense, because distance no longer felt like independence, it felt like vulnerability. We walked toward a black car parked near the edge, not flashy, not attention-seeking, just precise, like everything else about him, and as he opened the passenger door for me, I hesitated for a fraction of a second, not from doubt, but from the weight of what stepping into that car meant, not just leaving the wedding, but stepping fully into something I had not planned, something I could not walk away from as easily as I had walked in. Emily, he said, and my name sounded different now, not like a question, not like a claim, but like something grounded, something chosen, and I looked at him, really looked this time, at the man who had stepped into my night and changed its direction without asking permission, who had seen something I did not know was visible and decided it mattered.